Olá, daqui Rafaela Cortês. As primeiras entrevistas que fizemos para a série Indústria da Ajuda na Palestina foram gravadas em 2022. Em janeiro, eu e o Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro fomos ao Líbano, onde entrevistamos ativistas e organizadores comunitários em 2 campos de refugiados nos arredores de Trípoli e Beirute. E em maio, já na Palestina, Inés Abdel Razek foi uma das primeiras pessoas que procuramos.
Hello, how are you doing?
Thanks for coming here.
Nice meeting you.
Olhando em frente pela janela de sua casa em Jerusalém, vê-se um poste e, presa nele, uma câmara de videovigilância. Como vários dos seus vizinhos, Inés Abdel Razek sentia-se vigiada. Aquela era só uma das mais de 1000 câmaras geridas pelo município nesta altura, em 2022. Desde então, o número de câmaras e a sua capacidade de identificação facial aumentou substancialmente, como têm documentado organizações como a Amnistia Internacional e a palestiniana AMLE. Esta entrevista foi gravada, então, à vista dessa câmara, durante a produção da série Indústria da Ajuda na Palestina. Aconselho-te, como de costume, a ouvires a série primeiro. Esta é uma conversa em inglês, guiada por mim e pelo Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Inés Abdel Razek nasceu de uma família de refugiados palestinianos da Nakba de 1948, de uma aldeia no norte, colada com a fronteira com o Líbano, onde se refugiaram. É codiretora executiva do Instituto Palestiniano para a Diplomacia Pública, uma organização palestiniana com foco na mobilização internacional e campanhas digitais para a autodeterminação palestiniana. Antes disso, foi responsável da advocacia no Instituto e, antes disso ainda, trabalhou como assessora política no setor humanitário. Passou pela União para o Mediterrâneo, em Espanha, pelo Programa das Nações Unidas para o Meio Ambiente, no Quénia, e pelo gabinete do primeiro-ministro palestiniano em Ramallah, com a pasta da ajuda internacional às políticas de desenvolvimento. Nesta entrevista, Inés descreve o impacto dos Acordos de Oslo na definição de um novo paradigma que, segundo ela, fragmentou e despolitizou a sociedade civil palestiniana. Esses acordos, assinados em 1993, criaram, entre uma série de outras coisas, um compromisso político entre o Estado sionista e representantes do povo palestiniano e uma entidade governativa interina para a Palestina, a Autoridade Palestiniana. Nesse contexto, vais ouvir Inés Abdel Razek referir-se ainda ao Protocolo de Paris, de 1994, o braço económico dos Acordos de Oslo. Basicamente, o documento onde se definiram como deviam ser as relações económicas entre Israel e a Autoridade Palestiniana. A política fiscal, a gestão das alfândegas, a circulação de produtos e de trabalhadores nas fronteiras. Para Inés, foi uma outra forma de gerir a ocupação em vez de a confrontar. Os Acordos de Oslo permitiram também a proliferação de financiamento internacional para projetos de cooperação entre israelitas e palestinianos, os chamados projetos People to People, de pessoas para pessoas. Muitos palestinianos, como Inés, chamam-lhes projetos de normalização, por assentarem no que consideram ser uma falsa premissa, de que palestinianos e israelitas têm direitos iguais e basta conversarem para resolverem as suas diferenças. Importa ainda saberes que Territórios de 48, ou só 48, é o nome dado pelos palestinianos àquilo que hoje é considerado o Estado de Israel. E, de resto, fica com Inés Abdel Razek.
Before turning into an activist, I actually worked 7 or 8 years in the aid industry complex, more in like multilateral intergovernmental organizations. So I worked at the UN, I worked at the Union for the Mediterranean, and when I came to Palestine, I worked also at the Prime Minister's office, doing specifically work on coordinating international aid to Palestine.
From the PA.
For the PA. Yeah.
Can I ask, why did you leave?
Because I could see that the overall structure of how the PA is dependent on the Oslo regime, and I think the Oslo Accords and all its limitations, from the Paris Protocol to the institutions it has created, is actually just managing the occupation rather than confronting it. And, all these bureaucratized system, especially when you're young, when you're in your 30s, like 2030s, there's nothing really you can move from within. And there's very little leverage in those institutions because of so much, again, complex bureaucracy that has been created, where it's very difficult to move a system to change or even policies to be, created or implemented.
Did you also feel that while you were working, or was that?
Oh, yes. Look, I think when it comes to international aid to Palestine, there are different sets of challenges that I think one has to look at. One is the framing, which I think a lot of people will talk to you about, which is the premise of why you give money has been set to state building and peace building. These are two frameworks that are completely wrong for basically a just future in this place, because they're still doing state building without Palestine having any sovereignty of a state, which means what it means concretely when you end up in meetings is that you end up negotiating with the Israelis or and the internationals to give you money for breadcrumbs instead of the machine to make the bread. And Israel controls the machine, the machine to make the bread. So that's what the PA is now doing in order to function. The PA is literally in order to provide services to people in the very small zones that it has been given to administrate. It's just basically administering services on behalf of the occupation. And it doesn't control natural resources, water, land. It doesn't control borders. It doesn't control collection of taxes. All taxes are collected by Israel, although they're Palestinian taxes. So anything that you want to do in terms of development and socioeconomic development is artificial and is controlled by what Israel's interest is, which means that eventually this has transformed, the economy into a colonized economy where we import from Israel. We're the largest market for Israel. And there's very little productive sectors and workers, meaning that most of the Palestinians want to work in Israel to get wages or work. And they're like exploited, basically, workforce. And Israel is presenting that as, look at these Palestinians that we're letting, work in Israel. And I think the framing is an issue. Because you cannot, if your diagnosis is wrong, then your solutions will be wrong and your investments will be put in the wrong place. And it's obviously not only in Palestine, right? It's you don't talk food sovereignty. You talk about accessing food, and which lends to absurd things like cucumbers, because it takes a lot of water. So the Israelis decided it would be better for Palestinians to keep the cucumber to grow in the West Bank, and basically, we sell them these cucumbers that they put in, and then they reproduce as pickled to sell them back to us much more expensively, and I think they realized that, right? That
and then Palestinians pay taxes on that.
Yeah. So the framing is one. The other is obviously then, okay, who sets the priorities? And who sets the priorities for what needs to be a program, a project, an investment? And that's when you see how the PA functions and the international community. When after Oslo, you had a lot of international consultants coming, and also World Bank, IMF vision being put into what the PA should do. And it had to do with state building instead of confronting the occupation. So it literally consolidated the status quo, because it goes around all the obstacles of the occupation to actually get to a sovereign state, and it deals with the status quo and the reality as it is, which means For example, they said, well, agriculture, basically, it's probably was too... First, it wasn't sexy at the time, right? Like, who wants to do agriculture, And we need to be a service economy, innovation, and so on.
At the time, meaning that's the time...
After the 90s, yeah. And especially in the 2000s, after the Second Intifada, where really that state building really accelerated. So agriculture was left aside, which means, I think in terms of the budget of the PA, it was really ridiculous. And obviously, Israel was taking more and more land. So it could expropriate more land. It was controlling the land. Areas like that divide and that artificial divide that was serving also the occupation of like zone A, B, and C of the West Bank, that whole fragmentation also was served like further annexation by Israel. And at the same time prevented any agriculture or food sovereignty to be possible. At the same time, a lot of money is given to the security sector. I think it's 40%. It's really insane, the numbers. And also the workforce of the PA. I think around 40% of the civil servants paid by the PA today is for security forces.
Wow.
And that serves Israel's interest. Why? Because there's security coordination with Israel.
Again, a service provider for
yes.
Israel.
And so I think when you look at agriculture, for example, and the choices that were made, it was like, okay, let's be export oriented and also monoculture. So they did choose certain types of crops that are very heavily, water consuming, not made for the local market. So these kind of choices were made also by the Palestinian Authority in line with international consultants that are brought to build those plans and policy plans and programs. At the same time, any fundamental infrastructure and public services were hindered by the occupation. So Oslo created all these committees where Israel has to approve any water infrastructure, economic decisions have to be taken in joint committees. So they've created these bilateral committees where obviously Israel has all the control and all the sovereignty, and they can take the decisions and they can tell the Palestinians no. And there's nothing that the Palestinians can do about it. So for so many years, there has been those plans to build wastewater treatment plants and solid waste management. But it was all in Area C because that's where there is empty land, Israel didn't want Palestinians to build in Area C or to gain any access to it.
Yeah.
And now, as you can see, all the settlements are there, and the settlement expansion has been huge in the past decades. So that's another part of it, is how does this function? The larger picture and the big picture is actually most of the aid kind of strategy and direction is taken at the ad hoc liaison committee. It's the name of this committee that is basically that has been created by Oslo. It's chaired by Norway, and it has the UN in it, and it has Israel as well as the COGAT, which is the army branch controlling the West Bank, is named the COGAT, Civil Administration of the occupied they don't say occupied, obviously they don't recognize it's occupied, they say, so its name is COGAT, Civil Administration, but it's actually the army, and it depends on the defense ministry because it's a military occupation. These are the people who decide on permits, who decides on whether farmers can go into their land behind the wall, who are doing all the infrastructure projects for around the settlements. Like, they're dealing with the West Bank. They're basically, let's face it, I mean, again, they're the ones who control, not the PA.
That committee is...
So the ad hoc liaison committee is the international kind of forum where you have the UN, Palestine, Israel, Norway, the IMF, and donors who meet and kind of set the directions for the Palestinian development in the West Bank and Gaza.
And so no Palestinians are consulted in that process?
The PA is there, yeah. And it's a farce because, again, it ends up being Palestinians and the international community begging Israel to let one or two projects happening or tax money to be released. So, and Israel has done that with everything, right? They take the whole forest and then they ask you to negotiate a tree, and then a leaf, and a branch, and that's what they've been doing. And this way they create the facts on the grounds, and they also they have huge political leverage, because at the end of the day, we're talking about Palestinian lives who've been made dependent on that aid and that PA infrastructure. And so this is how the overall aid function. You have the occupier and the colonizer who's sitting in the table of what to decide for Palestinian development. And obviously that is very hard to question, because again, once you set forums, once you set committees, once you set reports, that are being published every 6 months on this, etc., it just takes a lot of political will to change that. And so that's, I think, another chunk is really the operational institutional model that has been created is set to maintain Israel's domination of decision making.
And you do think that is a direct result of Oslo?
Yeah. Well, before it was the occupation where Israel was controlling everything before the creation of the PA. And I think the PA has been made to accept that. So in a sense, the PA is trapped because they have to provide these services, right? The hospitals, the schools, the salaries, which has created this circle where PA employees are in debt with the banks and they depend on their salaries, and schools have to function, and so the little that is Palestine PA controlled has to function. And obviously if that collapsed, that it impacts a lot, like millions of people.
Yesterday, Mahmoud Muna from Educational Bookshop was saying something that was really interesting and we never actually thought about, was the PA functions as an NGO also.
In what sense?
That they receive money from Israel and other organizations, foundations, and states to then provide services to the people, just like an NGO, but with no political power.
Yeah. So, but that's exactly the overall issue of the framing, is that Oslo was built in a way that all the money and the credibility, or the let's say even not the power, but let's say, I think the Palestinian the Palestinian infrastructure, political structure, was basically transferred from the PLO to the PA, which means the PLO became very irrelevant, emptied. All its administrations are like basically doing nothing. It's an empty shell, although it should be the political representative, right, of the Palestinian people. But it has been completely swallowed by the PA. But the PA was supposed to be, and it's still on paper and how it has been built, a temporary administration that is only controlling Zone A's, and only in that the civil affairs, and not even the borders, or again, the fundamental things like the water underneath their foot, right? So that structure that was supposed to become a state never became a state. So it's this proto-state that indeed should only be actually an instrument of administering services, but then the PLO, and there should be a political representation confronting the occupation. So it's not contradictory to have some form of Palestinian administering services, but then we should recognize that it's only that. Like a municipality, it's big municipalities, that are administering services, but with obviously very little power control.
So is there no formal structure confronting the occupation then, like an institution?
Well, that's the overall contradiction of what Oslo created. And basically, it's like the PA is dependent on the occupation to survive, while at the same time pretending to still confront it, but it's not. And the PLO and leadership has maintained that the Palestinian leadership that is very aging and lacks legitimacy, they have maintained that line. They have not changed the strategy or the path forward. They keep telling people, yes, our national project is to get an independent state, but at the same time doing nothing to actually get that state, or to reverse the power dynamics so that we can get leverage to actually get a state, or liberate Palestinians, because now many people think that obviously that whole state building project or even the statehood project is not going to liberate Palestinians from a colonial ruling.
And is this power dynamic something people talk about within NGOs and NGO leadership? Is this recognized, like the way that it's designed to kind of uphold the status quo? Or
yes, and this is where the depoliticization, I think, of civil society plays a big role. I think there is very little. There has been very little space for NGOs who are questioning the overall system. The NGOs that are working on, things like governance or even democratic empowerment and so on, are only asked and kind of framing their work in terms of the PA should do better within the constraints that it has. Okay, it should be less corrupt when it gives a contract to a company. It should be doing better governance and so on, but without looking at why is actually the PA not able to function at all or so limited, and why is it prompting corruption and profit from an elite of people instead of all the people? It's because it's fundamentally the overall structure should be questioned. But NGOs only exist because they're registered under the PA. So if you want to be registered under the PA, you have to accept the frame of the PA. And so it's kind of like we don't have a constitution for all Palestinians. We have a basic law, which is kind of the constitutions for Palestinians who live and have a West Bank or Gaza ID that live under PA control, and not even in Gaza now, it's Hamas, but it's a bit of another story. But let's say West Bank Gaza is under this basic law, this constitution of the PA, where you're supposed to have like freedom of speech and again, like accountability of leaders and then this legislative assembly and so on. Obviously, all of that could be improved, but it's only limiting in the sense that limiting to what the PA can do, which means not control your border, not control the natural resources, not control the money, not control the import exports, etc. That all is Israel. So the NGO sector has, even those working on accountability are looking at that lens of just holding trying to hold the PA accountable for what it can do, but not questioning the problematic overall lack of sovereignty and lack of power for Palestinians overall. And the NGOs otherwise have become service providers like the PA. They've become part of the service provision. Like in other countries, it happens, right? When there is no state, or there is what they call fragile states, then the NGO become the service provider, which is wrong, right? NGOs shouldn't be administering schools or water pipes and so on. This should be the public sector, but in the absence of, that's what also the NGOs are doing.
So they're also perpetuating the occupation?
I mean, they're just alleviating the burden of it for populations, really.
And do you think it has a place? Like, is that good? Like, does that need to happen also? Because, I mean, there's a few ways of looking at it, right? I mean, you can say, this is just not helping enough. This is not challenging the structures. So let's just stop all the NGO work and create chaos and let it burn so we can then build something new. Or you can say, people are suffering every day, so we actually need to.
Yeah, no, I think there's part of the NGOs that are doing a great work, to be honest. I think part of the problem is, again, in order to be an existing NGO today, you need to be registered in the Ministry of Interior of the PA. So you need to abide by certain rules. And being very political is clearly one of them. Not being political is one of these tacit rules.
Tacit. But how does that then actually happen every day?
Yeah. Well, again, I think after Oslo and with the state building project, take all the actual political civil society that led the first Intifada and were part of the PLO, women's unions, student unions, all kinds of political media and so on. All of this has been integrated into that state building apparatus, dominated by some political factions, and depoliticized in a way that it has been shifted to women empowerment and democratic fabric of the Palestinian society, and all of these things that are actually not politicized and not political. So all of these political fabric of society has been broken. The media has been controlled by the PA slowly, and all of these unions, again, controlled by the existing factions dominating the PA, and basically asked to follow that, that path, that lead. And which means that today we're lacking when we say civil society today in Palestine, it's a very depoliticized civil society. We mean NGOs, but actually civil society should be politicized unions and women's unions and media and all these, social movements, political movements, all of this that makes a democratic society functions even before elections can happen. And that is what's missing, and that is what it's hard to put in place, because the moment you become active in certain structures, you either get then beaten up by the Israelis and jailed, or beaten up by the PA.
And do workers in the NGOs get in trouble if they get too political?
Yes, because obviously then, NGOs are a lot dependent on international funding, and they're dependent on the renewal of their licensing from the PA. So actual freedom of setting your own agenda is I think, an illusion. So inherently that depoliticization again of civil society has come with this state building Oslo regime. And I think another dimension that's very much there today is, and again, that's not exclusive to Palestine, is then how an NGO can function, and I guess the competition for international funding and how do you get international funding has made that a lot of the agenda is set by criteria and systems and methods that are, designed in London or Paris or, that are not that are not fit for this context that we're in, that's extremely political, that everything is political.
And did you feel personally constrained, limited?
So we have a model where we have private funding that is not looking at our mandate, for example, as an NGO.
But I meant like before. So when you were working at the aid work industry, did you feel that, for example?
Yes, very much. You mean for NGOs, for the funding that goes to NGOs?
I mean, if you personally felt limited, constrained in your political work for the fact that you were working at NGOs, I mean, for the reasons you were mentioning, because of the funding, because of all of that.
So I was not working with NGOs, I was working with the PA. But basically, I could see the NGOs who would get funding from the institutional donors, and I can see it today as being part of an NGO. There is a lot of conditioning that happens, in terms of how you build your objectives and how you build your, even project-based approach instead of core funding. It's all project-based. You need this project, this project, this project, instead of, okay, can I just function as an organization? And again, I think if you look at the human rights organizations that exist, they don't confront the PA much. They're looking at human rights. They're looking at human rights from a legal perspective and from, respect for human rights as the system as it is, without questioning that, again, the overall political structure is a problem and we need new representation and we need to break away from that limitation that only Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are considered Palestinians today. Because you have to realize Palestinian refugees have been completely marginalized from this. Palestinians in 48, even more, they were told, okay, now you will be Israeli. And I think the NGOs have kind of accepted that framing too. And if we take the example of Jerusalem, is interesting because the PA is not present. So all of the Palestinian work and structures are from civil society organizations.
Can you give an example?
Well, all the Jerusalem NGOs providing, help on education or youth camps, and it's a lot about culture, cultural organizations. All of these are Palestinian NGOs that are kind of registered under Israeli law. And a lot of them are struggling because the moment they become political, then Israel shuts them down. And they depend on international funding. And it created a lot of competition among them. It creates also, again, it has to be in line with the parameters set during Oslo. So it's East Jerusalem. Yes, okay, some presence in East Jerusalem. But it's...
maybe in specific neighborhoods and only that.
Yes.
The moment they use the word apartheid, it's over. Is that it? Is that
Yeah, a lot of the NGOs are not allowed to put in some of their documents certain language. And the language has changed, obviously. Yeah. And you can see, I can send you also the research that has been done on this about the evolution of language in the donor side, of how occupation and basically slowly depoliticizing even the analysis and the assessment of why it's the problem. Why do we have this unemployment and economic problems? In Jerusalem is very striking because you have an Israeli municipality that has annexed the whole of Jerusalem and they control the whole of the city, yet they invest very little in East Jerusalem. The infrastructure is poor, the schools, the waste, management, the roads, the employment opportunities are very poor. And that's because, obviously that Palestinian side, there is no Palestinian institutions there, and they're abandoned by the Israelis as well, who say they control, but they don't care at all about East Jerusalem, and they want to take over with settlements. And so there you have then international donors who are like, oh, well, there is a large unemployment in youth, and we need to empower youth to be able to be their own employers, and kind of completely erasing the context. And why is it that East Jerusalem is in that situation right now? And trying to find solutions that, again, are not looking at the problem of annexation and occupation. And why you end up having youth that get out of school and drop out of school and don't get a job.
So they don't make the link to occupation. It's just, there's unemployment.
It's just how can Palestinians, it's trying to bring it back to what can Palestinians do in the current context. And that's what has been framed, because the international donors, they're coming from an assumption that they cannot pressure Israel, because Israel destroys infrastructure that's EU funded. They will build, shelters for Bedouin communities, and 2 months later, Israel will bulldoze that, and they will repay it again, and no one will be held accountable. And so the international donors are having this assumption that because they can't move Israel on anything, which is not true. They have a lot of leverage, but they don't use it. There is no political will to either sanction or even, ban cooperation with Israel, condition any form of aid or cooperation with Israel, on the situation with Palestinians. There is no political will there. So they're just building on the assumption, okay, but what can Palestinians do for themselves? Which turns into short-term solutions, and solutions that are thinking that we can become a startup nation. And, I don't know how many incubators of startups and entrepreneurship we have in this country, or for Palestinians, with, again, very little, the education system is not fit enough. The research and university system is not mature enough to have all these successful startups. And we're clearly, in these protocols and these Oslo Accords, we're interdependent with an Israeli economy that's completely crashing us, and with which we cannot compete, because they have the military industry and industrial complex and growing economy with a labor force from the Palestinians that allow them to grow. And so how can we compete with that? Yet the solutions that are proposed to Palestinians is, let's all become entrepreneurs, and which is really sometimes, it's very absurd.
Yeah, I think that the thing you were talking about, the depolitization of the language, even the language you use, is something we encountered in Lebanon. We even had people telling us that people working at UNRWA, for example, were strongly discouraged to not talk about Palestinian history or teach in schools Palestinian history. Is that what they mean by neutrality? Is the erasure of Palestinian identity?
Yes, exactly. You're really they're trying to impose a certain narrative and a certain view that this is something between two sets of people, two entities, and two people who have a dispute, and it should be resolved through dialogue. And there's only a difference in views and narrative. There's only a breach of trust, which is, again, a very wrong diagnosis, given the power dynamics, given it's a settler colonial situation and apartheid. And so all of the solutions that are being proposed, whether it's youth empowerments and trainings and capacity building and to infrastructure building, is set to kind of make sure you just accept that framing, which means that the way that the projects are designed, for example, there's very little internationally supported work that is trying to bring together Palestinians in 48 with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, or refugees together with other Palestinians, to bring that unity. It's participating to keeping the fragmentation where it is. And again, proposing wrong solutions. So I don't know, you might interview other people who will tell you more about this, but there's then the all other aspect of people-to-people projects, like peace-building projects that are trying to bring together Israelis and Palestinians. That overall framing is very wrong. It cannot apply here because, again, it creates this false equivalence that this is just an issue of trust. And that if an Israeli and Palestinian, go around the table and eat hummus, then, there will be peace and justice. I mean, it's like you would ask a black person and a white person under apartheid to just go around the table and discuss, and then suddenly, the whole system would change. No, the black people had to fight for their rights, and it's about unequal rights until we have equal rights nationally, national rights, collective rights, and individual rights. Then we can't go around the table and negotiate because you're not we're not on the same, level playing field. We're not equal here. And that's what Palestinians are fighting for. Yet, again, when you're part of the NGO industry, you're asked to accept that, and you're incentivized through grants and through proposals, to actually work with the Israeli NGOs. So you have to actively refuse that.
Which means refusing money.
Yeah. And now today, especially after 9/11 and in the past years, there has been also the conditionality on terrorism, which is another story. But you might want to dig a bit into that. I can also send you more.
I think that could be an entirely different interview.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, it's also very specific, I think, to Oslo because, legally, the PA refused violence as a method of resistance, right? Which is international law recognized the
right to resist.
The right to resist through violence. But the Oslo Accords is written there that the Palestinians refuse violence or the political representatives of Palestinians refuse that as a method. Did that kill somehow also civil society movements and resistance against the occupation?
No, I wouldn't put the fracture line between non-violent and violent. There is non-violent ways of being very political. And I think that also has been killed. So even if you choose the non-violent path to organize politically as an NGO or as a civil society organization, you should be able to, again, do something that's political and questioning and basically working towards decolonizing, whether it's decolonizing agriculture, or trying to work on agriculture, or trying to regain our water rights and not just water access. It's not about getting a pipe with Israeli water or a truck of Israeli water sold to us. It's about actually being able to access our renewable source, our water. And I think that has been discouraged again because it's much more easy to build a project to just have this pipeline from this point A to this point B and not questioning that it's actually Israeli water that you're just buying. And I think then the Palestinians have become more dependent, because also NGOs, they pay salaries. It's fairly stable when you get international funding. It's sometimes higher salaries, especially with international NGOs that are present here. They get higher salaries than with Palestinian institutions. So there is that whole economy that's been based on that too, on that international presence.
And is it easy for Palestinian workers to rise to leadership positions?
No. Well, it's changing. But the answer is no. I mean, they're still sending internationals for the more senior positions. I think there is a lot of good Palestinian-led organizations that are also dependent on international funding. But again, it's very hard for them to maintain that international funding if they become political.
So is it like a strategy to put a white face in a leadership position just so it doesn't look too political? like, does it being like a Palestinian presence in leadership means it could be a little too political for that sake?
But I mean, again, for international NGOs, yes. Yes. Definitely.
Like the big international
Yes.
Red Crosses and stuff.
Definitely. They will not put a Palestinian at the head. Look, I mean, when I was in the UN and we had questions related to Palestine, I was working on global affairs, right? But there was a file. Not in Palestine. I was actively prevented from working on that file because I would be biased. Although I have the expertise. I know the file better than anyone around that office. But they felt because I'm Palestinian, I would be biased to work on an assessment on something related to Palestine and Israel. Yeah.
But how,
So-
how does that work? Like how actively?
Because the entire framing that has been put to the world is that there is just two competing narratives and no one is right. Like the Israelis have their responsibilities and the Palestinians have their responsibilities, and this is a bilateral issue. And therefore, you're considered one of the biased parties. That's what's been presented to the world. And that's still how a lot of the international community sees what's happening here.
It's a conflict.
But
Yeah.
would they say the same thing, or have you ever seen the same thing happen with the case of an Israeli worker, for example? Are they prevented to give input or be heads of projects that involve this issue, the Palestinian question?
No, of course not. Well, no, because on the Israeli side, when they work on Israeli NGOs or international NGOs that have branches on the Israeli side, they often have Israelis at the head of it.
So it's a double standard.
It's a double standard. It's a double standard, like diplomats. You have diplomats in embassies in Tel Aviv who are binational, Israel and that country, although they're extremely biased, right? You will never have diplomats who do political affairs who are Palestinian and that country in the Palestinian side. So there is that double standard, for sure. And because, again, it's not exclusive to Palestine. In any colonial setting, there was this issue about the colonizer and the more dominant have their voice better heard. When they say something, they're taken more credibly than the dominated and the weak, and that has been, always the case. When women, were fighting for their rights, it took only just a man to say exactly the same thing so that it would be taken seriously. And here we're in the same situation, unfortunately.
And how was it to work for the PA?
The PA has been created from scratch, again, for a state building project. You've transformed freedom fighters of the PLO suddenly into bureaucrats and technocrats from one day to the other. It's not like there was a long history of administrative, culture building, or institutional building. That didn't happen. So it was very artificially built, which means that until today, a lot of it is maintained on personal. It depends on individuals and personal relationships. And the biggest form of corruption created by that whole system is nepotism. Corruption here doesn't happen much on the financial level. Like when people hear corruption, they think, oh, millions of dollars like diverted. It's not like that here because of such a scrutiny and presence of international, institutions. And because of, Israel is always like very happy to kind of, say that a dollar here or a dollar there went in the wrong way. So that's very controlled, the finances. But the whole system is based on nepotism. It's who is the cousin of this fighter, so we have to reward him for this, family ties, people who were in prison together, or people who were, they did that in that time, they did this for the PLO, so they will get their son or daughter get a job. So it's more like that it works. And like business, the big business people being very close to the PA people. So having, their company chosen over another one. So that's how it works. And so this is why it's very difficult to work in such a place, because you can't change that at the moment, especially because, again, the PA has just to accept the way it functions. Its survival depends on accepting the occupation. But there is good people, again, in the PA. There is people who believe that they're just civil servants who are just trying to do something for this country to function. And to be honest, if you look at in 2011, the World Bank issued a report saying, well, I think Palestine is ready for a state. They did say that, right? So to be fair, like compared to a lot of other contexts, like without sovereignty, without controlling any of the economy and fundamentals to build the state, the Palestinians did actually manage to build all these institutions that are functioning. So it's not the problem. Money is not the problem. Institutional building is not the problem. The problem is that you don't control, you don't have power, you don't have political, you don't have self-determination, you don't decide for yourselves.
But inside that big machine, you were a really small piece trying to get funding to Palestine. Was that like, what was your role there, and what did you do in working?
No, I was basically, we were trying to make sense of the international money that would come in to the PA in terms of, is it responding to the overall policy plan that has been set?
Okay.
Again, the policy plan having very big, ambitious political objectives out there, but impossible to really implement. So it would be very kind of concrete. But then in practice, that you would have like this donor directly talking to the Ministry of Health, and then talking to the Ministry of Agriculture, and then the Prime Minister's office not knowing about it. And the overall kind of then having these competing and duplications of things, where the donor has an interest in health sector or in education sector, right? And so basically then you realize that, well, it's not based on overall needs and coherence, it's based on the offer. And I think it was, how do you make sense of that, but also setting some of the priority programs like programmation and that's, again, that's where you feel it's an absurd exercise, because then you have, well, your textbooks are a problem. So we won't fund your education until you change your textbooks that are anti-Semitic. And so they started being very focused on that, which is extremely, again, biased, and basically trying to make Palestinian textbooks not feature Israeli soldiers in the occupation or teach about the Nakba and history. That felt the Israelis, like there was active Israeli lobbying for making seem like the history of the Nakba is an anti-Semitic thing to teach to children.
And that is a concrete example. That's a real example.
Yes, I can show you the studies. There has been really outrage. Right now, the EU money to the PA is withheld, and frozen at the moment because of that textbook issue. I mean, we reach really absurd levels where Belgium, they froze and actually suspended their help to the education sector, which is actually the basic sector you need to help, Don't help the security sector, actually help the education sector if you help something. They withheld the funds, they suspended the funds because of the name of a school that was named Dalal al-Mughrabi. Dalal al-Mughrabi is a freedom fighter who was a armed resistant fighter. And because of Israel making high lobbying saying she's a terrorist, and there is this school funded by international funding named after a terrorist, then, you should withdraw your money.
What do you think is the role of UNRWA in all of this?
Look, UNRWA my dad went to UNRWA school, so I think they provide essential services to refugees that eventually wouldn't have them. I think UNRWA somehow, like, there should be the right of return. So UNRWA shouldn't be needing to exist, but I think they exist. However, they've been, to me, the problem of UNRWA is the problem of all UN agencies, which means internationals have extremely insane salaries. There is insane administrative costs. And I think, like, a lot of the Palestinian staff there also have a situation that is very different from the other part of the population, which means when you have a UNRWA, salary or staff position, you're also in a different social status than many of the local population. So I would say it has a lot of the problems of all UN agencies. But I think until there is right of return, or that is practically being implemented, I think UNRWA will still need to exist. I just think that indeed, like, I think there has been corruption, there has been a lot of these issues that should be reformed from within. And
a lot of people that we talked to, and when we were telling people that we were doing this story that started on UNRWA, although not only about UNRWA, I think also even like Palestinians who were talking to us, they were like they had mixed feelings about exposing, challenging UNRWA, because they say, yes, they have so many problems, but they are the witness of the occupation. And so, I mean, if you are, let's say, an ally of the Palestinian resistance, like, why do a story about that when there's so many other things? Do you also feel that? Do you also feel like that?
Yeah, and it's the same with the PA, because it's a double-edged sword in the sense that actually the PA should just become an administering services and should not be the political, like, entity representing Palestinians. And so there is a lot of arguments towards actually that whole system should collapse, that whole Oslo system. However, when you say that, that means it brings the danger of first endangering so many Palestinian lives who depend on that, but also kind of leaving the way for Israel in the current power dynamics to take over and do whatever they want.
Like an absence of power.
Like an absence of Palestinian political organizations that could take over. And
where do you stay?
No, and also because there are Israelis now who, instead of, like, even in the so-called, like, the liberal Zionists, like Peace Camp or left liberal Zionists, they're like, well, the PA is kind of subcontractor to the occupation, so let's defund the PA. We're like, no, actually, let's defund the occupation first, and let's defund the military and apartheid first. And I think that's what's happening with UNRWA as well, is that Israelis and allies are actively trying to suppress UNRWA and to erase UNRWA in order to erase the right of return as an issue, and to make Palestinian refugees not refugees anymore. And I think that's the problem, is that you can very quickly fall into being trapped into what the Israelis want if you asking for UNRWA to be disbanded. Because actually UNRWA is what maintains Palestinian status as refugees and making sure that Palestinians have the right of return, which they have. And the Israelis are actively trying to have basically Palestinian refugees being erased as refugees and not being counted as refugees anymore.
But on the other hand, I mean, we've been talking for an hour, and it seems like everything you say kind of
opened new doors.
No, it was another thing, though. So it seems like everything you were explaining kind of shows that both the PA and UNRWA, but let's talk about the PA, is perpetuating the occupation. So doesn't it need to be dismantled?
I think the PLO, the PA shouldn't be taking the decisions. The PA
should be just the states and not the.
It should be the administration of services. because it doesn't represent all Palestinians. And
But can you reform the PA? Is it possible?
no, you need a political representation for all Palestinians. Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, 48 refugees, diaspora, who can decide on, okay, what is it that we want for our future? And how do we confront this colonial entity that's controlling us? That's the change of strategy that needs to happen. But the political leadership that is controlling now and has the power, and the power is concentrated in very few hands today, is not willing to change the strategy. So until there is a political leadership and representation of Palestinians that should be made of all the different pockets of resistance and representation, from refugee camps to 48 to West Bank and different parts of society today, beyond the big factions, they should be able to say, okay, we are now going to an anti-apartheid struggle, and it will be an anti-colonial struggle. And this is what we're going to do. And part of it is dismantling Oslo and making sure that while Palestinians can survive in one way or another and still can keep their schools and hospitals open, that there should be a political confrontation to the apartheid regime. And that's what the political system doesn't do right now, the political leadership. They have voted on it. The PLO has voted to end Oslo. It was never implemented because there's too many incentives and pressure also from the US and from the Europeans and from the Israelis to maintain the status quo as it is politically.
And does your work today go towards what you were saying?
Yeah. Internationally trying to show that this is apartheid and settler colonialism, and that what needs to happen is Israel needs to be held accountable. Because at the center of all what is happening is impunity. Because Israel does what it wants. And that's the problem, is that behind that, the PA accepts. So it's really a big trap that I think Oslo has created for the Palestinian leadership. And there needs to be new leadership that takes another complete other strategy, that rebuilds a movement that is fighting apartheid instead of just managing it.
I'm just wondering, I don't know, is that possible? I mean, that maybe comes from my background in abolitionism and anarchism, but is it actually possible to change the PA from within, or to...
No, not from within. No. It will have to come from external forces. It's not about reform. You cannot reform the PA. You just need to create consensus building mechanisms. There needs to be an assembly of... there is effectively a mechanism called the PNC, right? The Palestinian National Council, which is the PLO assembly. But even the rules to elect that are not democratic.
And it's owned by the same person, right? Owned meaning led by the same person.
Yeah. Imagine, it's just that we would effectively need a mechanism with which, because I don't even know if elections is the right approach, but you would need a form of making sure all Palestinians, wherever they are, have a say in a form of assembly of the people that then decides on the way forward for the movement, and that doesn't exist. And it's not going to be, again, through the PA. You cannot reform the PA at this stage. You need to find another way for Palestinian representation and leadership to emerge, taking into account the existing factions and the existing very fragmented diversity of the society. But that needs to happen, and definitely not through rule of law reform that the donors are financing.
You talked a lot about the statehood project or state building project. Is a state the goal of Palestinians? Is having a state the goal of Palestinians? I think you said something like, I took note that the statehood project is not going to liberate Palestinians. What does that mean?
It means that if you look in the long history, Palestinians and Palestinian identity exists in the overall land, right? From the river to the sea. That's a fact. Like Palestinian identity, Palestinian culture, Palestinian history is there. an overall territory. And then there was this artificial splitting imposed, like partition. We will partition this. This will go to Jewish Israelis with ethnic cleansing of all the Palestinians there, or many of them, the majority of them, and you will just get this 22% of the land to make your own state. So already that was prompted by the vision at the time of the Europeans and of the European-led Zionist movement to create nation states here and two divided states. That was imposed, that was artificial. And over the years, while the early days of the PLO and Fatah was the liberation of all Palestine to create one democratic state where Jews and Christians and Muslims would be equal, they sort of were pressured into accepting that idea of a two-state solution, two states that would be separate, that would be nation states. And clearly, the Palestinians have compromised. The Palestinian leadership have accepted. And Palestinian streets, the Palestinian society would have probably accepted if it would have happened. But Israel was never interested in that. They always had in plan to annex the overall territory between the river and the sea and make it an Israeli Jewish state and basically control and ghettoize the Palestinians, if all those that it had not managed to expel, just to contain them into Bantustans, into small
a one-state
territories. And so effectively that whole statehood project of we will have an independent state is not working because it's like the power, it's not changing the power dynamics, and it's not also ensuring that Palestinian refugees can get the right of return and that Palestinian collective rights as a national group, in a sense, can have their rights recognized to self-determination. So statehood doesn't mean you can get self-determination. And I think that was the overall, bet of that strategy was, but it has failed. And so that's why people question it today.
Because, for example, Mudar Kassim, that we're interviewing next week, I was listening to a talk class that he was giving on the topic of self-determination. He was making this argument that I also never heard about before, that today we talk about self-determination always as a nationhood, but the beginning of self-determination was not nationhood, was actually peoplehood. And yeah, I never really thought about that, but it was even saying that at this point, I don't really need a state, because if that means that I'm going to stop being arrested by IDF and will be arrested by the PA, it's the same. I just want to have self-determination as a people, as a person. But is that the majority? Do the majority of Palestinians think like that, would you say?
I think the reality and the experience of most people today actually makes statehood very irrelevant. Whether it's under domination and constraints or not. In the sense that, again, today you have Palestinian workers crossing checkpoints every day to work on the Israeli side and have Israeli Jewish bosses. You have settlers that go in and out of the West Bank as they want. They can go to Jordan without seeing a Palestinian. So it's more the relationship of dominations that exists between people, rather than the idea that there is borders or states. That you have institutions. Jerusalemites, they haven't seen the PA and PLO in people who are in their 30s today. What do they know of PA and so on? They're under the Israeli state apparatus and control.
It does seem like after the wall, the Palestinian question for, let's say, people in Tel Aviv, it's over, really.
Yeah, I mean, it has erased the Palestinians, for sure. That's where, for them, what they call calm, quiet, peace is actually just when the violence is only felt and experienced by Palestinians every day. And the Israelis only wake up when they are feeling the violence, unfortunately. That's what makes them move. Otherwise, they think everything is normal, is freedom, is democracy. Well, it's democracy for who? It's an ethnocracy for Jewish people. So I think statehood is definitely, in a sense, irrelevant for many people, even those who are not politicized or don't wake up every day thinking about liberation, only think about jobs and family and, surviving out here and having a life. To them, again, people here, like we pay taxes to Israel in Jerusalem. People pay taxes to Israel.
Acabaste de ouvir uma entrevista com a organizadora e investigadora palestiniana Inés Abdel Razek, gravada em 2022 durante a produção da Indústria da Ajuda na Palestina. Podes ouvir essa série de 4 episódios em qualquer aplicação de podcasts. Esta entrevista foi feita por mim, Rafaela Cortês, e pelo Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. A Margarida David Cardoso cortou-a e escreveu isto que te estou a ler. O Bernardo Afonso editou o som, Joana Teresa Batista fez a identidade gráfica, o Lucas Grimo de Freitas a estratégia de comunicação e o Fred Rocha tratou do website. Consulta em fumaca.pt, série completa, um monte de outras entrevistas, visualizações de dados e uma extensa lista de livros, filmes e podcasts que nos foram úteis nesta investigação. Fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaça António Assunção, Luís Marquês, Maria Almeida e Nuno Viegas. Até já!